Hello, a massive congratulations to all of you who submitted, and of course to the winners and the runners-up of this year's festival. I loved judging this year. I think there were some brilliant films submitted. There was different favourites for different judges, but we finally came to a decision, and I was very impressed by the diversity of conservation stories and ways of telling those stories that were submitted this year. So a massive well done to you all. And I've been asked to tell you a little bit more about my background and also give bits of advice. Firstly, in terms of picking winners, it was really hard. I have to say, two of my favourite films that really stood out were A Seal Story and In Nature. A Seal Story because I, for one, am a massive fan of seals. I think it's a really important conservation message, and it was told really well, and it was shot really well as well. And then In Nature, I thought was a really different way of telling, again, a really important message in a funny way and an engaging way, and through animation, which really caught my attention. I think it's a space that perhaps a lot of people haven't yet tried to approach, but there was a lot to be said with the film In Nature that was submitted. And that's why it was one of this year's runners-up. So congratulations to both of you who made both In Nature and A Seal Story.
My two favourite films in the festival were Beavers, Nature's Engineers and Light Night. I think I'll start with Light Night. I think I was a little bit biased on that, simply because it's something that I feel very strongly about. The first thing I did when I moved here, for example, is there was a kind of government-given big street lamp in our driveway, but we're in a farm in the middle of nowhere, and the first thing I did was take it down. The stars are a beautiful thing, one, to look at, and two, there's so many animals that are affected by artificial light, and I don't think many people realise that. So it kind of goes back to what I was saying about the importance of conservation films, and Light Night for me was a fantastic way of illustrating the issues in a very emotive way of what the hazards of artificial light. It's seen as like a sign of progression, and I've seen it all through my career and life, where I've lived in beautiful, very remote place in the world and then gone back to it, and they've been given solar power, which is obviously a sign of progression, but instead of staring up at the Milky Way at night, talking to people, everyone sits around a TV, and every single house has a luminescent light outside covered in moths, and you can't see the Milky Way as good. So I think Light Night for me was a very personal favourite because of that. It tells that story of the dangers of artificial light, and it causes huge problems for our wildlife and the natural world. But hopefully, I don't want to give too many spoilers away, but if you watch Light Night and you see when it all goes wrong for humans and we don't have any more artificial light, hopefully everything can bounce back and go to what it was like. We don't need big LED or luminescent fluorescent lights outside of our houses and along our streets every single place. Sometimes it's nice to be in the darkness. My second favourite choice was Beavers, Nature's Engineers, and well, first and foremost, I thought it was a completely amazing animation, really original, all done by hand, and nice to see in the credits how it was done. And it goes back to, I think, appealing to the masses. Beavers are an incredibly important engineer, as the title suggests, in our ecosystems, and thankfully the shoddy British government seem to be finally getting that. They say they're getting that, and more beavers are appearing in the UK, and long may that continue. And I think this film is a fantastic way of educating people. I think there's a mixed response. Obviously there's nothing to be scared of about beavers, but how important they are, and that animation tells that in a nice, accessible way and an attractive way. So for me, it was just the simplicity and the beauty of the animation made it a winner for me.
Well, one of my favorites for sure was In Nature. I thought was really charming in its animation. It had that sense of humor, and it's really quite simple. But the combination of the narration, which had a certain charm because it's a young girl, I believe. It sort of gives a lightness to this whole idea that it's sort of putting forward to kind of in a great way kind of educate us about things that I think probably most people don't even know or suspect, or you know what I mean? And it's like, oh, okay, this whole idea that animals are like us, essentially, you know what I mean, in ways we hadn't even imagined. but it delivers it in a way that is very fun and a bit surreal in the drawing style, which I love. So that definitely was one of my favorites. I really really enjoyed that one. I also liked. I'm going to all just animation, but I also liked the Beavers film because again, it had a bit of a sense of humor. It had a real, ecological message as well, like sort of, again, reminding us of the benefit of beavers. And I just, from a filmmaking point of view, I just liked the style. It's very simple, but very effective, versus, going in and trying to find beavers and, photographing them or filming them in live action. You take, photos and you make, cut out, and then you can actually make a story that really resonates in a very simple way. I also liked the portrait of Don McLean and Life in the Clouds because I think that it showed a generational point of view of how things have changed in one man's lifetime. And when you think of that impact in a very literal way, I don't remember his age in the film, but let's say it's 80 years. That's nothing in when you talk about an ecosystem or geological terms. And the fact that, things like animals vanishing, agriculture coming in, plants vanishing in that short of amount of time is alarming, which I know is something we're all dealing with now. But I think what was nice about the film, and it's actually kind of poetic too, so it wasn't like heavy-handed in it to me, because he was kind of a genial guy, and even though he was telling a sad story, there was you liked watching him tell it or listening to him tell it. So it was like almost like an oral history, handing down his knowledge. So I thought that was had a lot of charm as well. I enjoyed that, even though, again, the thought of it was a little bit harrowing when you really allowed yourself to think about what he's actually saying. So for me, working in animated films, maybe it's probably intersected potentially to a lesser degree than it has to with some of the other judges involved. But I was fortunate enough to work on a film called The Lorax, which was based on a Dr. Seuss book, which centered on conservation and particularly mankind's ability to sort of irresponsibly destroy everything around it. And it centers on this character called the Lorax, who sort of comes and warns this man called the Onceler about the consequences of his actions, which, of course, in classic human fashion, he ignores, to the great detriment of not just the ecosystem, but himself at the end of the day, and sort of a recognition that we're all in this together. The plants, animals, and us as people. So anyway, so that was and it was an interesting project because we were making a film for a large studio trying to hit a big target audience. So making the film, make the message resonate, but also make it entertaining so that people want to hear the message. I think that's an element of it versus, I guess, scolding, for lack of a better word. So that's what we tried to do, and we incorporated music and found ways to expand on the book to tell this story. So essentially, that for me was the big kind of intersection, and I was very excited to be able to be part of that project. And I think that I know the book still makes the rounds in certainly primary school, and I've had a few people over the years that's the favorite thing that I've done that I've worked on for them, and I think it's because of the message and how it speaks to them. So it seems to I've actually had some staying power. It came out not quite 10 years ago. And so that's very exciting to know that message continues to be passed forward.
First and foremost, before anything, I was into wildlife and conservation. I actually went to do wildlife conservation at university. Only lasted a year before I got cabin fever in a classroom and wanted to be out doing it. And I guess that's when I was already doing photography and film a little bit, but that's when I went into film more as career and realised, well, I realised quite early on in terms of my photography how it can be a very important tool to get in front of people that might not be, most people aren't actually interested in reading so much into conservation, but stimulating them visually through photography and film is a lot easier to get a wider audience, in my opinion. So I guess that's where it started, when I realised how important it can be as a tool for conservation. And I think it's going more and more now because of, festivals like this, getting it in front of people, short films, social media. People can be scrolling through and just seeing a 3-minute little film pop out in front of them, or footage or photography, can tell a really important story in a quick amount of time. We're all on our phones and we don't actually have very long attention spans anymore, unfortunately. So even, if you're watching something on Netflix or something like that, you're probably still on your phone whilst you're watching it. So that's why short films, I think, are even more important to tell those stories, to kind of grab people's attention, tell really important stories. And that was not what was nice about judging this, was seeing such a wide range of stories, telling really important stories. And I'm quite involved, or feel I'm quite involved in the conservation scene in Europe, at least. And, I learned things about projects that I had no idea about, like the seagrass sowing ones and stuff like that. It's a really cool short film that completely took me, I didn't know anything about it. And in 3 minutes, I was educated about an amazing project.
So one thing I always like about seeing animated films, particularly short films, is that when I judge a festival, there's a range of styles available to you in animation, which is very interesting and can be very exciting for filmmakers. Clearly, there's the probably the high end, which is computer animation, and you're doing it all, but that you don't have to do it that way. And some of the things I've seen, even if they're cut paper or hand drawn, but they're not hand drawn like Disney, where it's 24 drawings per second. It's hand drawn and you've got 4 drawings per second. You know what I mean? But your mind is able to fill in the gaps, the in-betweens, as they say in animation, and you can still tell a story that way, even if the imagery has a simplicity to it. And again, I think that's one of the great things about animation, is it can tap into that innate appeal of drawing. And I always use the example of the cartoonist Gary Larson, who did a lot of things about nature and ecology. Actually, he had a cartoon called The Far Side, and his drawings were innately funny. Computer animation is innately unfunny, actually, because it's very, you're in a computer and you got to kind of, but a drawing, if somebody does a doodle, it's, it can be brilliant and charming. And it's just one of those things that, because it comes from within, versus when you're computer animating, you have to pull it out. It's a very different experience. So I think with animation, if somebody wants to do something, oh, I've got an idea, but I just want to do it with simple drawings, do it. Because, in a lot of ways, it'll probably have a lot more charm than something that's highly rendered. I'm not saying this about all computer animation. I should be clear, because that's not true. But I am saying, if you're a filmmaker and you've got a limited budget and you're one person or 2 or 3, there are options out there beyond live action shooting with animation, that you can create something very unique and distinct. With not a lot of technical prowess, and that's kind of the cool thing about it.
Unfortunately, I think it's getting harder and harder to do it through photography now. So I think that probably makes the decision easier for me. First and foremost, I am a wildlife photographer. But for example, I have a conservation project I'm working on here in Spain now, which is actually a rewilding, agri-wilding project. So I sold my best lens to basically fund to buy more land, but that was my best stills lens. So I guess now that's why I'm going into more film, because I can do it with not lower end kit, but less kit, a less specialist kit. My camera's all film. And like I say, of course, you can get hard-hitting pictures that really jump out at people. And I've taken a few of those in my career, especially on stuff like the illegal wildlife trade. But actually probably the more important things are the films I've made and that I've helped make. I think, like I say, that so I guess that's what chooses. I think now for me, film is a more important tool than photography, perhaps. And I think more people are watching films as per reading articles or looking at photos. Photography is harder in a way that you've got to get a really, really good it's always hard to say good hard-hitting photo, but you know what I mean. Hard-hitting photo that tells a story and an important story with one image is a lot harder than making a 3-minute film that tells a story, I think.
I'll be honest on that. I have very little experience with that because I work for Universal Studios. So, and the funding for things I work on comes from them. So I think the question being asked is about more, like building something from the ground up. I mean, look, there are things out there like as simple as GoFundMe, that, if you've got a passion project and the budget isn't huge, that you can actually, there are ways, just online to get funding. So I think what I would say, what I can identify with this question is that, or what I can identify with, is that no matter what, you have to kind of think about what you're doing, how you're going to do it, and how much it's going to cost, and be realistic about that. Because I think that even we, with the size of our budgets, which are significant, there's a limit. And so you have to kind of figure out, okay, here's the schedule, what do we have? And how do we make it within that schedule and within that budget? So I think whenever you're looking for funding, have a realistic idea of what the project is, even if you change it along the way, which you undoubtedly will, what the project is and how much it's going to cost. Try to be realistic about that versus lowballing, because then you're going to find yourself in trouble as you're running out of money towards the end of your production.
Funding can be a real minefield, incredibly difficult, basically, not only because of lack of funding, but also competition for funding. On the Nightingale film I did, we actually crowdfunded. We had a tiny bit of private funding, and then the rest we crowdfunded. And that actually went very well, but I think you can only do that so many times. I think it's obviously high risk to fund it yourself. I'm trying to think, I haven't really funded any of my own filming projects at all. I have in the past funded a few photography projects, but I just knew because they were so unique, I kind of took the gamble that they'd pay back basically by selling the project afterwards, which isn't as easy to do in filming. And it's not actually easy to do in photography anymore either, hence me not doing it. I think now there's a lot of NGOs out there that have important stories to tell that might have a little bit of cash in the pot to make films. And it's always worth, if you're passionate about a certain subject, researching them and approaching those NGOs, because a lot of the time, half the problem is actually getting access to the story as well. So if you're working with an NGO on a particular subject, habitat, species, you'll automatically have that access straight away, and they might be able to either provide funding or open further doors for funding as well. But yeah, it's really tricky when you're up against it. I've seen certain festivals, for example, film festivals, and they say like low budget films, less than £250,000 or dollar budgets. Well, I think that's kind of insane because that's a BBC Natural World. I think it's like it used to be around 250 grand or something like that. Nightingales, we did that on a £15,000 pound budget, I think, in the end. And we were lucky that all of us gave up our time for free, really. So obviously that made it cheaper, and we felt it was a high quality product at the end of it. But we all decided we wouldn't be able to do that again, especially in an hour long, for the amount of time we put into it. But hopefully it educated a lot of people and stuff like that. So I guess it's risk and reward, but we're not wealthy people, so we also need to make a living, and I think that's what people have to be realistic about. We could make amazing films, but if you're basically not being able to survive because you're not making any money, then it's a tricky one. So you've got to get the right balance, I guess. And yeah, funding is incredibly important. Look for interesting but also important stories. That's probably what I'd go for first and foremost. You know, there's lots of stories being told. Some are being repeated, which isn't always a bad thing because we need to nail it into people's heads. But yeah, there's lots of untold stories about maybe the less sexy species and not as interesting projects, or what some people might not perceive as interesting. And I think for me, one of the example films for me is the seagrass film, the sowing the seagrass seeds, because perhaps people don't find seagrass the most interesting thing. But, you know, we're all going on about carbon sequestration and planting trees and stuff like that and rewilding on land. But why shouldn't we be doing that at sea as well and providing these incredibly important habitats that we've lost? So yeah, just look for those kind of stories and stories that excite you as well. I think that's the main thing. Don't just take a story on for the sake of it. I think you need to have your passion in it as well. So, for example, I made a film a couple of years ago called The Last Song of the Nightingale. And that's simply because I kind of became obsessed with nightingales. And I thought it was an incredibly important story to tell. And even though, you know, I've spoken to producers and I've had it said to me in meetings that people don't want to hear about birds, but I felt that the nightingale was a bird people needed to hear about. And as a species, it could represent a whole range of species, not just birds, but tell an important story. So yeah, also, yeah, you need to be passionate about your subject, and yeah, tell that story. And people might tell you no, but forge on ahead, I guess, unless it makes you bankrupt, and maybe don't. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, just be passionate and yeah, follow those stories that you really want to tell.
So my background is as a biologist and a filmmaker, bridging the gap between conservation and storytelling and broadcasting is quite hard. You know, you may have a really powerful story, but perhaps you don't have the skills and the tools or the production value or the budget yet to put something like that together. Or you have lots of production value and budget, but perhaps you're looking for the right conservation story. It's a bit of a journey that I think all of us are on when we're starting our careers, and I, for one, definitely find myself being attracted to stories in conservation that I think are so important to tell, but perhaps are limited by, let's say, if it doesn't get picked up or commissioned. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do that story. And one of my top tips, and one of the things I learned early on from friends I made in the industry, is to build up a nice team around you, a team that you work well with, get on with, share the same values and what conservation stories they want to tell, and make a plan about what you want to set out to do. Don't be limited by, let's say, you don't have the most fancy camera kit. It doesn't matter. You may not have the biggest production. It doesn't matter. If you've got a good story to tell and a good team, let's say someone who's hungry to be the next camera operator, or who wants to do long lens, who wants to be an editor or a producer, and you yourself want to be a presenter, there is a brilliant hungry team which can learn all together, develop those skills and build up a portfolio while putting your work out there and learning about how to build these skills and to put these stories forward, which ultimately is the most important thing. You really don't need kind of all the bells and whistles at the first stages. And I think that's one of my biggest tips, if you like. But if you're thinking, I want to go into conservation or filmmaking, you can absolutely do that, and surround yourself and connect with other people online who are doing similar stuff.
I think a lot of the stereotypes that you think about are actually kind of true. And what I mean by that is you have to get people excited very quickly. So if it's a lot of exposition, and then this guy went here, and this guy went over here, and then they met over there, and then this lady comes in, that's probably not going to work. You know, if you can, I mean, like, there's a few things you can hang your hat on. You can hang your hat on high concept. You can hang your hat on a character, a world. You know, so there are different things, or a story itself. You know what I mean? So there are different big ideas that you can hang your pitch on. But I think you have to do it in a way that it's very gettable and people understand why they're going to support it and support you. And I think that's another aspect of it, is that when you pitch something, you know, be clear about your enthusiasm and your point of view on it. You know, I know that sounds like a no-brainer, but like sort of coming in and like being clear about what you want, but also having the flexibility to change it if you get an idea that actually takes from somewhere else that takes your idea and improves it. In a lot of ways, I say my job as a director, and I work with a large team, 250 people, but is to get out of the way of an idea better than yours. Now, not everybody has that point of view. That's just mine, because this is a very collaborative animation. Is over a long period of time, a couple of years, the movies we make. A lot of people in and out. And, if people have great things to offer, don't let your ego get in the way. Say, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's do that. You know what? You're a storyteller, regardless of, whether it's a documentary. I mean, if you think of some of the best documentaries you've seen, and it's quite evident when it's not working. Documentaries that don't work aren't telling a story well. It's as simple as that. If you can put up all the archival footage you want, but if you're not telling a story that pulls somebody in, it doesn't work. And you know the difference. So every film that's made, whether it's based on real people or an animated film, it's all about telling a story and pulling your audience in. And so that's really what your pitch has to be. There's a great book that I love called *Sapiens*. And basically, the foundation of that book is that all humanity is based on storytelling. And that is, that is the truest thing I think I've ever heard. If you think about, well, I don't want to get into political stuff, but let's go with something simple. If you think about money, for instance, it's a story we tell each other. There's nothing real about it, So I think that, so you're sort of becoming part of that culture of storytelling, and you've got to think, how do I make somebody believe in what I'm telling them or want to tell them? And that applies to any kind of filmmaking.